My family always praised my achievements. "You make us so proud," they'd say. But when I read their emails, I discovered they were using my success to keep our relatives out of a fortune I never knew we had. I grew up thinking my family was as plain and supportive as they come. We were close-knit, simple people from a Pittsburgh suburb. Nothing fancy. My dad was a mechanic, my mom ran an old-school bakery that struggled but somehow survived year after year. Our extended family wasn't vast, but they were around for the important events, always coming together for birthdays, holidays, and summer barbecues in my parents' backyard. Whenever I achieved anything, no matter how small, my parents made me feel like a superstar. First spelling bee? They clapped so hard, I swear people must have thought I'd won an Olympic medal. Every time I brought home a decent report card, my mom would pinch my cheeks, saying, "Our girl is going places." And when I got into a well-regarded university on a partial scholarship, they cried with pride. But looking back, it's funny how I remember my mom's face during those moments, not just pride, but something more. Tension, maybe. A slight tightness around her eyes. I never thought much of it. I just figured she was overcome with emotion. They'd always been supportive. Or so I thought. One winter holiday, after I'd moved to Seattle and landed a steady job, I was back home to visit. My mom had been complaining about how disorganized her home office was. It was essentially a catch-all room, a spare bedroom crammed with boxes, half-functional printers, old laptops, and papers strewn across the desk like a blizzard had hit. She'd been saying she wanted to clean it up for years, but never found the time. So, I offered to help. "You really don't have to, Adela," she said, waving a hand at the mess with a dismissive laugh. "It's just junk. I'll get to it one of these days." "Mom, it's fine," I said, already rolling up my sleeves. "We'll make it a mother-daughter bonding activity." She looked at me for a second, almost wary. I'd never seen her hesitate like that. But she gave a half shrug and said, "Fine, but don't blame me if we find spiders." I got to work, opening boxes, sorting out old receipts, and finding things from my childhood I hadn't thought about in years. Mom sorted through some papers herself, but after a while, she left me to it, wandering off to make tea. I was starting to lose steam when I found her old laptop. I turned it on out of sheer curiosity. Maybe there'd be some ancient family photos on it, or funny emails from when she first started her business. As it booted up, I realized she was still logged into her email. I know, I shouldn't have opened it. But there was this folder labeled Family Correspondence with about 100 emails inside. Curiosity prickled at me. I assumed it was just messages from Aunt Lorna and Uncle Philip, our only other close relatives on my mom's side. They were scattered around the country, and I hadn't seen them in years. I clicked. The email started out innocently enough. A few congratulatory notes on my milestones, getting into college, graduating, landing my job. But as I scrolled down, the tone changed. Some of the messages between my mom, Aunt Lorna, and Uncle Philip were odd. There were hints, allusions to some kind of family trust, an inheritance. I furrowed my brows, skimming each message as I went, feeling my heart rate tick up with every line. Apparently, my grandparents, who I'd always thought were just ordinary people with a strong work ethic and frugal habits, had left behind a fortune. They'd never spoken about it, and I'd always assumed their lives were as modest as ours. But they'd invested quietly over the years, building up a surprising amount of wealth through real estate and some old family holdings that stretched back to their parents' time. My grandparents hadn't told anyone except my mom and her siblings. And they'd left a very specific set of instructions on how that wealth was to be handled. My mouth went dry as I read more. The inheritance was supposed to be split among Mom, Aunt Lorna, and Uncle Philip. But there was a catch. My grandparents will stated that they could only pass on their shares if they were convinced their children were fit to carry on the family's legacy and values. Otherwise, the inheritance could be withheld in the interests of family dignity. The decision was left up to my mom and her siblings, as executors, to decide if any of us, their children, were worthy of it. I sat back in shock. All those times they'd praised my achievements, the tears, the applause, the big speeches. All those moments, they weren't just proud of me. They were scrutinizing me, evaluating me, deciding if I was worthy of a family fortune I hadn't even known existed. I couldn't believe what I was reading. All my life, I'd thought my family was just proud of me for being me. But here was my mom, praising my successes in these emails and then saying, "We're lucky Adela is turning out well. She could be our strongest asset for keeping things quiet." Strongest asset? Keeping things quiet? My heart pounded. My hands were starting to shake as I kept reading. The worst message of all was from Aunt Lorna to my mom, sent around the time I got my first job. Lorna was congratulating her on my success, going on about how I was the perfect cover. She even wrote, "If Adela stays on this path, we won't have to worry about any of the others asking questions." She went on to say that it would be easy to keep my cousins, her own children, in the dark if I was the poster child of the family, the successful one who didn't need anything. I stared at the screen, bile rising in my throat. They weren't just supporting me. They were using me. My success wasn't just a source of pride for them, it was a smokescreen. A convenient way to keep the family's secret hidden. When my mom came back into the room with the tea, I slammed the laptop shut, my face probably whiter than the snow outside. "You okay, sweetie?" she asked, setting the tea down. I didn't answer. I just stared at her, feeling like a stranger in my own family. I felt betrayed, tricked. All those years of encouragement, of support, it was all conditional. They weren't rooting for me, they were using me. "Adela?" My mom's tone shifted. She must have seen the look on my face.
I need to ask you something," I finally managed, my voice hoarse.
"What's this inheritance? What's the family trust?" Her face went pale, almost as if she'd seen a ghost. For a long, uncomfortable moment, she just stood there, holding her cup of tea, staring at me with wide eyes. "Adela, honey. Why are you asking that?" she said, her voice trembling. "Because I found your emails." My voice was flat, cold. "I know about the inheritance, the trust. I know everything." The silence was suffocating. Mom's face contorted, a flash of panic crossing her features before she quickly composed herself, forcing a calm expression. "Look, Adela. It's complicated." "Complicated?" I shot back, unable to hide the anger in my voice. "All my life, you made me feel like I was this big success story. I thought it was because you were proud of me. But it was just so you could keep the rest of the family out of some fortune I didn't even know about." She flinched, and I almost felt guilty. Almost. "It's not like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We wanted what was best for you. For all of you." "Best for us? Really?" I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice. "You didn't even tell me about it. You made me your cover story, Mom. I'm the strongest asset to keep things quiet, right?" She swallowed, and I saw her eyes glisten. "Adela, please, we didn't tell you because it's a lot of money. And money like that. It changes people. We didn't want you to feel entitled. We didn't want you to think you could take the easy way out. You've worked so hard, and we're so proud of that." "Don't say that," I snapped. "Don't say you're proud of me like it's some favor. You were proud of me because I was making you look good. Because as long as I was doing well, no one would start sniffing around, wondering if there was money somewhere in this family." "Adela, it's not that simple," she said, a bit of desperation creeping into her voice. "Your grandparents. They wanted to make sure the money stayed in the family, with the people who wouldn't waste it. They didn't want it going to someone reckless." I shook my head. "Reckless? What does that even mean? Who gets to decide that? You? Aunt Lorna?" She blinked, looking down at her tea. "They left it up to us to decide," she admitted softly. "They wanted us to choose who could handle the responsibility." "Responsibility?" I laughed bitterly. "You make it sound like I was auditioning for a job I didn't even know existed." She winced, and I knew I'd struck a nerve. But I didn't care. I couldn't shake the image of all those moments we'd shared, every embrace, every proud smile, every "we're so proud of you" speech. They were tainted now, laced with manipulation. "Adela, we didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice pleading. "We were only trying to protect you. Money can ruin people. We've all seen it happen." I stared at her, feeling the weight of years of trust crumble away in an instant. "No, Mom. Money didn't ruin people. Secrets did. You should have trusted me with the truth." She opened her mouth, as if to say something, but no words came out. I waited, a bitter lump forming in my throat. My mom didn't speak for a long time, her face a mask of confusion and guilt. I could see her struggling to find the words to explain herself, but there was nothing she could say that would make any of this feel okay. I was done with the excuses, the secrets, the years of manipulation disguised as support. The betrayal hit too deep, and I knew I couldn't let this go. For the next few days, I kept to myself. I needed to process, to think through what I'd discovered. But I also started planning. If my family was going to make decisions about my life behind my back, then I would start making decisions without them. I began by doing something that, for years, I never would have dreamed of doing. I called Aunt Lorna. She sounded surprised to hear from me. "Adela, what a nice surprise. We don't hear from you much," she chirped. But I could hear a hint of tension in her voice. She must have known that I'd found out. "I found out about the inheritance, Aunt Lorna," I said flatly. There was no point in sugarcoating things. There was a pause on the other end. "Oh," she said, a slight tremor in her voice. "Well, I suppose it was bound to come out eventually. Your mother told me you'd found some old emails." "Yeah," I replied coolly. "I know everything. And I think it's pretty disgusting, honestly. All these years, you all have been using me as a pawn. Making me your cover so none of your own kids would find out." Her tone turned sharp. "Now, wait just a minute, Adela. This money isn't something to take lightly. Your grandparents wanted it to be handled responsibly. Did they want it to be hidden? I shot back, did they want it to be kept from your own children? There was silence. Then, with an edge of irritation, Aunt Lorna finally muttered, your mother has her reasons. I hung up. I'd had enough of her excuses too. I knew my next call would be to a lawyer. If my mom and her siblings thought they could keep me in the dark forever, they were about to find out they were very wrong. I spent the next week consulting a local estate lawyer in Pittsburgh who specialized in trusts and inheritance. I told him everything, including what I'd found in the emails and how my mom and her siblings had kept me in the dark about the family fortune. The lawyer, a calm and methodical man named Mr. Green, listened carefully. Adela, he said slowly, if your grandparents left that money to all of you equally, then it's your legal right to access your share. The only complication is if there's language in the will allowing your mother and her siblings to withhold it. Is there anything I can do? I asked, feeling a surge of hope. I wanted to make them realize that I wasn't just going to sit back and accept their lies. We can petition for a full disclosure of the inheritance and all assets involved, he explained. If there's any irregularity in how it's been handled, you'll have grounds to take action. A few days later, he sent letters to my mother, Aunt Lorna, and Uncle Philip, demanding a full disclosure of the inheritance and an immediate meeting to discuss its division. The backlash was immediate. My phone blew up with calls from my mom, my dad, and eventually Aunt Lorna. They tried everything, from guilt-tripping me to making vague threats. But I ignored every call and forwarded all the voicemails to Mr. Green. I was done listening to their excuses. They'd pushed me out, used me, lied to me. Now they could talk to my lawyer. 2 weeks later, we all sat down in Mr. Green's office. My mom, looking drawn and exhausted, sat to my left. Aunt Lorna, icy as ever, sat across from me with Uncle Philip. They all avoided my eyes. Mr. Green had printed out copies of their emails, highlighting the parts where they discussed withholding the inheritance from their children and using my success as a cover. Your emails are clear, Mr. Green said, his tone professional but firm. You all used Adela as a pawn to shield the rest of your family from the inheritance. You leveraged her success as a way to maintain control over assets that legally belong to all of you. My mom's face crumpled, and she tried to explain. We were only doing what we thought was right. Adela doesn't understand. This money. It's more responsibility than she realizes. I understand just fine, Mom, I replied, my voice cold. You manipulated me. You hid the truth from me and tried to use me to keep your own kids in the dark. Also, you could hoard money you didn't even earn. Her face turned pale, and I felt a small flicker of satisfaction. Aunt Lorna looked like she wanted to argue, but Mr. Green shut her down. This is not up for debate. You have two options: divide the inheritance equally among all beneficiaries, as originally intended, or face a legal dispute in court. I could see them calculating, weighing their options. I knew that, in the end, they'd choose the easiest way out. They didn't want a legal battle, especially one that would expose their lies to everyone in the family. And I wanted them to understand that they weren't going to get away with it. 2 months later, they finally agreed to release my share. But I didn't stop there. Once the funds were transferred to me, I made a point to inform each of my cousins about the inheritance. I told them everything: the emails, the lies, the manipulation. I knew it would stir things up, and I wanted that. They deserved to know the truth, just like I did. One by one, my cousins confronted their parents, demanding explanations. Aunt Lorna's kids were livid, especially her oldest, who had been struggling with student loans and barely making ends meet. Uncle Philip's son was furious. He dropped out of college because he couldn't afford the tuition, only to learn that his own father had been hiding a fortune. My family fractured. The old bonds, the ones I thought were built on love and support, cracked under the weight of the truth. And I wasn't sad about it. They had used me, lied to me, betrayed me, and now they were paying the price. In a final act of closure, I decided to use part of my inheritance to pay off my student loans and then donated a significant portion to the environmental nonprofit where I worked. It felt like poetic justice, taking the money they'd tried to keep from me and using it for something good. The rest, I invested, but not because I felt any responsibility to preserve some family legacy. I invested it for myself, to build a future on my own terms. I didn't need their approval or their fake pride anymore. My mom tried to reach out to me a few times after that, asking to make amends, but I'd had enough. I told her that I was done with the lies, done with pretending. She'd made her choice, and I'd made mine. It felt good to walk away, to finally be free of the burden of their expectations. For the first time, I was living for myself, not for their twisted sense of pride. And that, in the end, was the sweetest revenge of all.